is Joshua with Think Liberty, and today we are joined by Gary Chartier. Gary is a distinguished professor of business and law ethics and associate dean of the Sapara School of Business at La Sierra University. He is senior fellow of the Center for a Stateless Society, author, editor, or co-editor of 13 current or forthcoming books and over 40 scholarly articles. How you doing today, sir?
Very well. Pleasure to be here.
Good. So, as I do with most of my guests, let me start off by asking you to explain your personal journey to the liberty movement.
Yeah, sure. So it's a kind of complicated story, I guess, that involves some twists and turns and some back and forth. I grew up with, I think, a lot of the characteristics that might often sort of predict that somebody was going to end up as an adult libertarian. So I had parents who were Goldwater Republicans. I read science fiction, I programmed computers, and I was socially awkward. But I think that led me in early adolescence to start thinking seriously about libertarian politics. And I found myself reading Hayek and Rothbard and Nozick over the next few years, and certainly being very, very intrigued and engaged by those. What happened, I think, was that when I got to college, I'm not sure I was really well prepared to think through libertarian responses to some of the challenges that I found myself facing intellectually, having to do with the fact that the world is a pretty awful place in some respects, and it just wasn't clear to me how a voluntary social order might deal with that. And I drifted for quite a long period into a fairly conventional, and I have to say, pretty uninteresting, kind of broadly social democratic position. Ironically, I think what really brought me back to libertarianism was, so there was some intellectual stuff going on, right? I spent my time thinking about legal obligation, realizing that there was, no realistic basis for claiming that some arbitrary authority could bind me in conscience. But frankly, what really, I think, played the biggest role was watching George Bush and Barack Obama at work. And I was really radicalized by the war making and just the general expansion of presidential power that occurred in the U.S. in the early 2000s. And I think that, together with the theoretical reflection, kind of brought me back to the libertarianism that I had happily embraced as an adolescent. This time around, however, I was really delighted to find resources that helped me perhaps think through some problems that I hadn't been able to satisfactorily engage with when I was younger. Notably, I discovered the resources made available by the people who now form the heart of the Center for a Stateless Society. As you notice, there I've been a senior fellow at the center for a while, but even before achieving that august position, I was really enjoying the work of people like Sheldon Richman and Roderick Long and Charles Johnson and Joe Stromberg and Kevin Carson, and really learning from them. And I think my intellectual world would be unrecognizable in the absence of their work. So they've certainly made a huge impact on me.
Right. So what moniker or describer would you use when telling others about the philosophy that you subscribe to?
I think that probably depends on the audience, right? So in a group of people, if you will, in the know, I might say I'm a left-wing market anarchist, or I'm a left libertarian. I think in kind of broader academic circles, where those would be fairly incomprehensible terms, that left libertarian means something, but not to most people what it tends to mean to us. There are probably at least 3 different meanings of the term, which makes things confusing. In a broader context, I'd probably just say I was an anarchist.
Nice. So can you describe what left-wing market anarchist means for those who may have some reservations about that title?
Of course. So let's start out with the building blocks of the term. So first of all, the position is anarchist. That is, I'm committed to a society organized on the basis of peaceful voluntary cooperation. I take anarchism to be ultimately the project of doing without the state. Of course, anarchism means doing without rulers and other people who engage in state-like behavior. I mean, you can imagine a mafia that didn't claim that it was a state, but that still engaged in the same sort of behavior states do. Certainly not a fan of that either. So first of all, then, peaceful voluntary cooperation as the basis for social order. That's the anarchist part. So market anarchist, obviously, I agree with Charles Johnson that there are lots of different realities that we can encompass under the heading market. And there's a sense in which most broadly we want to talk about a market as the space within which voluntary social cooperation takes place. And anything that happens within that space, I'm okay talking about as happening within the market space. But the term market anarchist, I think, is appropriately seen as singling out those varieties of anarchism for which robust property rights and market exchange form an important aspect of social order. That doesn't mean that people might not be free to think about other ways of organizing themselves, but at minimum that we recognize the real value of market exchange, of prices in coordinating productive and distributive activity and so forth, and of robust property rights, both as guaranteeing all the consumer benefits that markets make possible, and also at the same time accomplishing a number of other things, notably preserving an important space for autonomy and creativity and so forth. So that's the market part. And that means, since we're talking about market anarchism, of course, that in particular, the legal and defensive activities that are really crucial to maintaining social order, have to be delivered on an on-state basis. And, that could be, I imagine, in a variety of ways, some of them commercial, some of them non-commercial, but in any case, they would obviously have to be non-monopolistic if we're talking about a market anarchist order. So left-wing market anarchism, then, would be a species of market anarchism. What do I mean by left-wing market anarchism? So obviously, people mean different things when they talk about left and right. Some libertarians, for instance, have wanted to suggest that the best way to think about the right-left continuum is in terms of a move from no state authority to totalitarianism. And by definition, of course, then, if that's what you mean, it's easy to say, well, of course, any sort of market anarchism is on the left. But if you actually have something a little more substantive in mind, then I guess I would say, again, you can think about all sorts of different associations here. My own tendency in thinking about what I mean when I talk about right and left is to think about how, I guess, three groups of people in history might have understood themselves, three groups that I see as, in one way or another, antecedents. So I don't see, maybe it's worth just starting out by saying that, I don't see very much in the way of commonality with, if you will, the old left in the U.S., which tended to, say, in the 30s and so forth, tended often to be Stalinist and fairly scary in that way. But I think that as the Libertarian partnership with the new left in the 60s made clear, there really was a lot of common ground with that cluster of people in the new left, for whom things like opposition to war and decentralization and social experimentation were all important. Some people in the new left, notably, for instance, Students for a Democratic Society President Carl Oglesby, self-identified as libertarians, but of course a lot did not, and a lot weren't very friendly to markets. But I think that the underlying attitude that moved the new left is one that I find it easy to identify with. And that's an opposition, again, I think, to hierarchy. It's an opposition to centralization, and it is, in terms of social relationships, committed, I think, to inclusion and opposition to subordination. I don't think that has to mean anything like a sort of Procrustean economic egalitarianism, but it does have to mean, I think, seeing people as individuals with equal moral status and welcoming them into a community that doesn't exclude based on things like race and gender and so forth. The New Left is the most obvious antecedent, and I cheer for a lot of things, though certainly not all that folks in the New Left did. But we can go back and think, for instance, about Benjamin Tucker and the group surrounding him at Liberty, his publication, which really served as the first context in which American individualist anarchists thought about who they were and what it meant for them to engage with the wider culture. This was really the first time there was an individualist anarchist movement in the United States. And so I think just think it's noteworthy that Tucker saw himself as happily defending markets and property rights, in contrast certainly to anarcho-syndicalist and anarcho-communist alternatives. But he saw those other sorts of anarchisms as part of the same movement he was part of. And in what's probably his most famous essay, State Socialism and Anarchism, he clearly understands his sort of anarchism, a clear market anarchism, as socialist. What does he mean by socialist? Well, he clearly doesn't mean state control, but he also doesn't mean even a sort of voluntary, kibbutz-like arrangement with in which all of society gets treated as one large family. What he does mean, I think, is the elimination of state-secured privilege in a way that addresses the concerns that other anarchists and members of the labor movement and so forth, for which he was very sympathetic, all seemed to share. But also think, again, about those participants in the liberal tradition in the 19th century and the 18th century who railed against state-secured privilege, who saw free trade as tremendously beneficial to the poor, who were opposed to slavery, opposed to war, and so forth. And I think, these were folks who would certainly have been thought of as in important sense, radicals in their time, and yet who were obviously very much pro-market. So I think, simply put then, the left-wing piece of left-wing market anarchism is opposing exclusion, subordination, and deprivation and war, which I take to be the central foci of concern on the part of the left worth identifying with, embracing a heritage that includes people on the left, clearly self-identified with the left, like the New Leftists, like I think Tucker and his allies at Liberty, and arguably like some of those early classical liberals. It means, in short, taking on board what we think are the central concerns of the left and showing how these can be effectively addressed from a market anarchist perspective.
Gotcha. Yeah, perfect. So there's a lot of talk about right and left these days. I mean, it's a constant drag on any political conversation.
I agree.
What is your take on the current division of libertarians on the cultural right and left in the current social settings? You've been a guest on the Tom Woods show. What is your take on that rift as well between Tom and the Libertarian Party and how that's kind of unfolding?
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. It's not a rift I'm at all pleased by. I'm sure that sometimes I make snarky remarks that in one way or another contribute to that. And certainly I, have found things to disagree with Tom and, some other folks in Auburn about. But I am not interested in finding excuses for excluding people from the libertarian movement, certainly not from my friendship, but also just not from, from the organized movement. There are people I definitely find things to disagree about at a pretty profound level. But I don't want to begin with the assumption that because people disagree with me, they're crazy or evil. I just disagree with them. And I want to see a big tent libertarianism. I think it's very important for people to send the message that libertarianism is not a breeding ground for ethno-nationalism. I think it's important to send the message that libertarianism embraces the optimistic and inclusive social vision of the classical liberal tradition of which libertarianism is part. There are libertarians I respect who, for various reasons, disagree with me about that. That doesn't make me less confident about what I want to say in that regard, but it does mean that I want to be respectful in my disagreement. I'm very clear about what I think, and I think the position that C4SS and a lot of others have taken on open borders, on racism and related matters. I think those are important positions, and they're part of a vision that I take very seriously. But I'm not looking for opportunities to beat up on people who disagree with me or to read them out of the movement. I'm happy to express my disagreements, but I'm also happy to work together on those things that we care about, which typically include, opposing the state, opposing war, and so forth.
You've been insistent in the past that anarchism can be used as a tool to achieve social justice. Can you explain how this would work?
Sure. So, again, social justice is one of those terms that means lots of different things. And I share Hayek's doubts about the value of the term. While I am inclined to wear the left-wing label for the reasons I've described, I'm inclined to wear that label happily on my own. I think I often am more inclined to engage in social justice talk because I think that's a way in which some other people talk. It's not a way that comes naturally to me, because I think for various reasons it's vague and unhelpful and often gets read the wrong way. Sometimes I think social justice talk gets used to have to do with some sort of vision of state-managed distributive justice, where the assumption is that somehow there's a common pot that the state is entitled to parcel out to everybody. That makes me nervous. And sometimes social justice talk is just used to mean all the stuff people care about in society. I find that as a more and more common usage of the expression. And that's just so vague as to be unhelpful. We may care about lots of different things. People who use that talk and I may share concerns about a variety of things, but I don't know if we do share concerns about all of those things, nor do I think we're necessarily going to agree about the best way to address them. So I say all of that in advance to say I'd prefer to avoid the social justice talk if it has either of those meanings. The late Catholic philosopher and theologian Michael Novak recently wrote a book, co-authored a book with a title, I think it's Social Justice Isn't What You Think, which I reviewed for the Independent Review. And Novak, of course, was famously a pro-market guy. Novak felt that justice really, in Aristotelian terms, and he thought that those were the terms in which Catholics should be talking about this. He was writing to a Catholic audience. That justice should be understood as the virtue, as a virtue of individuals, not as somehow, to use Rawls's, it seems to me, unhelpful expression, the first virtue of institutions. And so Novak suggested that we think about social justice as the virtue of people who sustain social institutions in a variety of ways. I have no problem with that. When I've said in the past that we can achieve social justice through liberty, perhaps it's an intentionally provocative formulation, but what I've had in mind is that issues of exclusion and subordination and deprivation in the economy can be addressed through a cluster of uncontroversially libertarian means. That is, we ought to eliminate state-secured privilege, and we ought to remedy state-effected injustice. And this, in turn, will address issues of poverty and exclusion and probably contribute to, certainly as a number of people have argued, to making workplaces more livable. Why? Because state-secured privilege tends to funnel resources to the politically well-connected and away from those who aren't well-connected, tends to make it harder for people to earn a living, tends to make it the case that those who already have power then are able to access political power and use that to cement their positions. And so if you eliminate state-secured privilege, then the end result is, as Jeremy Wieland snarkily puts it in a great essay, you let the free market eat the rich. And the point is, if you're not insulated from competition, if privilege doesn't protect you from the effects of competition, then you've got to serve consumers on an ongoing basis in the market, or your resources go away. If you're interested in starting a small business or even just living comfortably in an increasingly high-cost world, that can be very difficult in the absence of the kinds of things that the welfare state offers, because we've got a society which limits the ways in which people can start small businesses. We've got a society in which rules make it hard for people to live inexpensively. Rules about everything from lot sizes to building codes and so forth, get in the way. So the bottom line is, and I can talk about this, I do talk about this in a bit more detail in a paper that I've done, and also in my book, Anarchy and Legal Order. But the bottom line is eliminating state-secured privilege, remedying state-effected injustice, letting the market do its work, and supplementing, of course, the work of the market with social support networks that, frankly, would be much less burdened than they are now because of overall levels of prosperity and better patterns of distribution, would enable a free society to address those concerns, which often prompt people to urge state intervention in the economy.
Right. So you bring up Rawls briefly there. One of the viewers wants to know, did Robert Nozick's effort to respond to Rawls influence your decision to write Radicalizing Rawls?
Not really, no. I mean, I think Nozick obviously was an absolutely brilliant guy, and as I mentioned, Anarchy, State, and Utopia was one of the first libertarian books I found myself reading, though frankly, when I was a late adolescent, I don't think I was equipped to understand all of the philosophical sophistication of Nozick's book. But, I have a great deal of respect for Nozick. But I wrote Radicalizing Rawls for a couple of reasons. So this is a book that I published with Palgrave in 2013 that basically argued that Rawlsians should be cosmopolitans and cosmopolitan Rawlsians should be market anarchists. Now, I'm not sure, frankly, that book was successful. I think it's not as if the Orthodox Rawlsians have been convinced, and it's not just because they're Orthodox Rawlsians. I think there's some very sharp people in that world, and what I tried to do in that book was to make a case. First of all, the bulk of the book was designed to make a case for Rawlsian cosmopolitanism. So there's this odd feature, I think, of Rawls that in A Theory of Justice, Rawls's best-known book, he's mainly talking about justice within a society that he explicitly takes to be bounded. People enter it at birth and leave at death, and the society is therefore just a collection of people without immigration, without porous boundaries, and so forth. And obviously, he recognizes that's just a model. It's not realistic. But the principles of justice, he elaborates, are ones that mainly apply in that society. He starts talking about what he thinks might be principles for a global order of justice. And notes these kind of in relation to some existing thoughts about international law. But he doesn't, I think, in any clear way explain why he doesn't think the business of thinking about justice really would apply globally. He does talk about some obligations, which are not obligations to people in one's own society. These mainly have to do with obligations in war. So he does think it, might well be a duty to avoid certain kinds of injustice to, non-combatants in a war, non-combatants who aren't part of one's society. And indeed, this was something that always obviously mattered to Rawls. As I understand it, as a young member of the military during the Second World War, he was horrified by the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and so he certainly was sensitive to the fact that issues of justice arose outside of one's own society. But when he talks briefly in A Theory of Justice and then in much more depth in his last, actually self-completed book, The Law of Peoples, about global justice, he clearly envisions this kind of two-stage process in which there's justice at the domestic level and there's justice at the global level. And at the global level, you're really talking about relationships among states rather than relationships among all the actual, individual people of the world. And what I tried to do in the first part of Radicalizing Rawls was to explain what I saw as problems with that view and to try to explain why defenses that were floated of Rawls's decision to do this didn't work from my point of view. Again, I'm not sure that effort was successful, but it was fun to try. I focused primarily on the Rawls literature in the legal context. And while there's been a lot of literature about Rawls in the law literature, the reality is there's been a lot more in the philosophy literature, and I only scratched the surface of that. And probably in the end of the day, that was part of the problem. In any event, it was an interesting effort. What I said, though, was once we can now just start to talk about Rawlsian global justice as the same thing as Rawlsian domestic justice, now let's go and look at John Tomasi's sort of heretical Rawlsianism expressed in his book, Free Market Fairness. And so in that book, Tomasi argues that with just a few tweaks, Rawls's account of domestic justice leads us to a classical liberal or libertarian conclusion. Tomasi's not an anarchist, but he thinks you can certainly get much more robust protections for property and other things that would make it tougher for the more social democratic variety of Rawlsianism to get off the ground. You can get those things out of Rawls without all that much tweaking. And while Tomasi's probably made that case more aggressively than some other people, that's actually a point that I think has been made by other Rawls commentators, including some social democratic and other readers of Rawls who've been unhappy about the extent to which that can be argued. So in any case, then I suggested in effect that maybe there would be a good reason to see non-state institutions as delivering the things that Tomasi in turn was imagining small state institutions delivering. And so we could make this third jump to a third stage from domestic Rawlsianism to global Rawlsianism to Tomasian classical liberal Rawlsianism to a particularly anarchist variety of Tomasi's view. So that's what I tried to do in the book. It was an internal critique. It didn't build on my own theoretical framework, and it wasn't, I think, particularly inspired by Nozick. It was really an attempt to kind of see how easily within the terms Rawls himself lays out, you could push him in a more market anarchist direction.
Nice. So let's talk about property rights. It's something that is also heavily debated and a huge time suck on many of the debates recently. Your views on property appear to be kind of a hybrid of the, say, deontological perspective of Rothbard and the consequentialist perspective of David Friedman, even though you seem to ascribe to a sort of natural law. Can you clarify your perspective and which view takes priority to you?
Yeah, so, the term natural law obviously gets us gets to a variety of places. People use the term natural law in a variety of ways. So let's start with that. A recent article in the authoritative Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy talks about natural law theories as featuring a variety of elements. And we might think about Aristotle as the real foundational figure in natural law theories, and we might move to Thomas Aquinas as the person who really kind of tied together certain key elements to give us the foundation for later natural law theories. And so if we think about that as a kind of paradigmatic view, with the recognition that not everybody is going to fit all of these criteria, this article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy notes the following 7 elements as paradigmatic of natural law theories. So one, this of course is there in Aquinas, the natural law is given by God. 2, it is naturally authoritative over all human beings. 3, it's naturally knowable by all human beings. 4, the good is prior to the right. 5, right action is action that responds non-defectively to the good. 6, there are a variety of ways in which action can be defective with respect to the good. And 7, some of these ways, I would say all of them, can be captured and formulated as general rules. So the natural law view, as I understand it, then is a view that builds on a concern with human flourishing, okay? And that goes back to Aristotle. The idea on the view I would tend to run is human flourishing, human well-being has a variety of aspects or elements. And we might think about life and speculative knowledge and the capacity for practical reasonableness, play, friendship, aesthetic experience, sensory pleasure, harmony with reality, however you want to think about that. Aquinas would have done so, of course, in the tradition of the Catholic way, but I want to frame it in a way that would work for people whose views are quite different from Aquinas's. So you've got these different aspects of well-being, and a sensible kind of moral order, a sensible legal order is an attempt to equip people to provide the framework within which people can realize these aspects of well-being. On the view I'd want to run, there are a variety of deontological moral principles. And most important among those principles would probably be, one, the principle that it's not reasonable ever to purposefully or instrumentally injure. And then there's the other principle that we should avoid making arbitrary distinctions among the people affected by our actions. So, I don't know, take a kind of straightforward example. My wife and I agree that we'll be sexually exclusive. I definitely don't want her to violate that promise, but I violate it all the time. I'm arbitrarily making an exception in my own case. So those principles are basic, I think, essentially deontological principles. Then the question is, what do those yield in terms of legal rules? And so my view is that for a whole cluster of reasons that I try to lay out in my book, Anarchy and Legal Order, and in some other stuff, that basic principle of fairness, which is, again, a deontological principle, gives us reason to embrace a legal system that enforces robust property rights. And there are, I think, probably over 20 different considerations that might be advanced to show why it's a matter of fairness to embrace that kind of scheme of property rights. So the principle of fairness obviously isn't necessarily going to say that under any and all circumstances those property rights are 100% inviolable. But the end result is a legal system that I think ought to treat them as such that either one never violates them, or if one does, one offers compensation. As an individual, deciding whether or not I'm going to take a classic Rothbardian example, whether I'm going to break into somebody's mountain cabin to escape an avalanche and so violate that person's property rights, it may well be reasonable for me. I might be able to justify that as fair in the moment, but that's different from the standpoint of a judge in a legal system who's enforcing a general rule that everybody has to accept and operate on the basis of, who might grant that, I shouldn't be shot if I dive in that window during the avalanche, but I'm not entitled to take over that property, and so I certainly need to provide compensation there. So the view that I want to run with regard to property rights is property rights are rights that the underlying deontological principle of fairness gives a legal system, the actors in a legal system, reason to embody in rules. So actors in the legal system should accept and enforce a set of rules that are rooted in this underlying deontological principle of fairness. Those rules would in turn make for robust property rights. So it's obviously different from a kind of Rothbardian view in which the property rights are seen as sort of direct extensions of my rights over my own body. But the practical effect, I think, is often pretty similar. It's just that the role that the deontology plays is at a lower level, if you will, a more abstract level, that then indirectly constrains what the legal system ought to do.
So in your book, Anarchy and Legal Order, which you've talked about several times, you discuss how biological dispositions can lead one to expect cooperative behavior, as well as the idea that morality is crucial to such cooperation. To you, are morals objective, subjective, or something else? And how do these ideas mesh? And what role does force play in a society absent the state?
Yeah, so lots of questions. So biology, I think, is just one of a bunch of things that we might expect to make cooperation possible. And I just think there's both good sort of a priori game theoretic evidence of the kind that Axelrod's pointed out, and good a posteriori evidence of people's cooperation. We find this in kind of experimental game theory and so forth. The fact is, people are not perfect. People are not morally flawless. But what we find is they do, in fact, cooperate a lot of the time. And they don't just cooperate when they're afraid somebody's looking over their shoulders. It really is the case that for, again, I think multiple reasons, some sort of ideological, some probably biological, and, and so forth, people do, in fact, not only recognize the instrumental value of cooperation, but indeed internalize that value, accept it as a value that they themselves embrace, not just as a way to get to their own goals, but as something that they think is appropriate to do on their own. So, the question of objectivity and truth in morals is hugely difficult, and I certainly don't claim that I've got some secret sauce in the back that enables us to solve the really serious, challenging problems that are posed by the need to understand what it would mean for ethics to be objective. I proceed on the basis that we can say something objective about ethics, and the natural law tradition, going all the way back, as I say, to Aristotle and Aquinas, tends to want to talk very much in those terms, that we really can say something intelligible and sensible about what counts as human flourishing, and what it is for creatures like us to flourish, and why part of flourishing for creatures like us is acting reasonably, and why acting reasonably means embracing a variety of requirements for how we might think about things. So I would say the basic requirement of understanding the various aspects of well-being as, in some interesting sense, objective. This principle, as I said, that we don't instrumentally or purposefully cause harm. The basic principle of fairness that I noted already. The principle that we ought to reason efficiently about how to achieve our goals, and the principle that when we make plans and we structure the various goods that we're going to pursue in our lives, we maintain priorities and so forth, we ought to at least ordinarily stick to those plans unless we have some good reason to do otherwise. So I think these five principles, which I'd call the principle of recognition, the principle of respect, the principle of fairness, the principle of efficiency, and the principle of commitment. These aren't very unique to natural law theories. You're going to find versions of them in a number of other views, especially others influenced by Aristotle. But I'm certainly prepared to defend these and run with them. I'm very much aware of the challenges there are to spelling out and defending objectivity in ethics, but I certainly haven't given up on that.
Nice. And so I guess I lumped some questions together on accident there. What is the role of force in a society absent the state?
So, as I've said, I think that what I want, the kind of society I want to defend, is a society rooted in peaceful, voluntary cooperation. So obviously, that's not, I think, just an ideal, but I think it is a serious constraint on morally reasonable behavior. So with regard to force against people's bodies, I think that principle of respect absolutely rules out in all cases purposeful or instrumental injury to other people's bodies. And the principle of fairness certainly places robust limits on interference with people's property. I think the principle of respect doesn't rule out the use of defensive or remedial force, but when one does engage in defensive or remedial force, again, I think the principle of fairness gives us reason to limit the amount of force we use to the minimum necessary to defend and remediate, and might sometimes even limit more than that. It might be that, for instance, the only way I can defend against some minor injury is to cut your arm off, and it might well be that it's just not appropriate for me to even go that far. I wouldn't want that, or wouldn't want my children treated that way, or whatever. So, in any case, I think force is certainly appropriate. I'm not a pacifist, and I think that force can be appropriately deployed for defensive or remedial purposes, but I think the use of force in any just society has got to be radically limited.
So, do you believe that in a stateless society, it would be inherently market-driven, or would you expect an array of varied economic and social arrangements?
So people like to experiment, and Mill famously talked about the importance to the liberal tradition of experiments in living. I would expect there to be a variety of both physical and virtual communities in a stateless society that would try out different ways of living, different kind of legal codes and different social norms. I certainly don't think there would be any way of mandating from the top the adoption of commercial exchange. However, again, it seems to me that over millennia, we've seen that trade makes people's lives better. And therefore, it seems likely to me that lots of people would want to engage in trade, and indeed that even those in the equivalent, let's say, of kibbutzim, who might operate themselves on a collective ownership model, might still find that it made sense for them to trade with other communities in ways that were more, kind of conventionally commercial. I think market exchange does good things for people. It's made human lives dramatically better, especially over the past 300 years, and I would expect it to be widely adopted. But I also would expect that communities would try out a whole range of interesting possibilities, we'd get to see what those look like in practice. So, for instance, to take an obvious example that's shown up a lot in the literature, among people who are fundamentally committed to the value of market exchange, you find different views about certain aspects of property. And so you've got folks who take a broadly Lockean view, in accordance with which one can claim ownership of say a piece of land, and absent some kind of abandonment, one can just retain that, and that might be distinguished from the sort of Tucker Ingalls view, in accordance with which maintaining ownership requires personal occupancy. Again, there might be an abandonment period involved, but the idea is that an agent can't really occupy on one's behalf on that view. And then, of course, you've got the Georgist view that sees something troubling about land ownership entirely, and either tries to collectivize land ownership, or else, if land ownership isn't collectivized, get the equivalent of collective land ownership with a land value tax or something like that. So I mean, I think one thing you'd see is different communities operating in accordance with those sorts of rules, and then we'd see what they looked like in practice, and we'd see, were there problems? Would there be, as I kind of suspect, some convergence over time as people found that things didn't work or did work, and so forth, and the rules would change. I think one of the awesome things about anarchy is that you really would have a lot of experiments with different legal systems. We'd see how they worked out, and other people could either imitate or run away in terror, as the case may be, depending on how successful different approaches turned out to be.
Right. With all these different societies within one society, I guess you could say, how do you think they would interact with each other?
Yeah, so, and obviously this is something that people like, Friedman and Rothbard and, others have spent quite a bit of time thinking about. So if you imagine, obviously some societies, if you're going to operate with a collective ownership model, if you're going to run a kibbutz, that probably needs to be geographically cohesive. On the other hand, you can imagine folks who were, clients of different, legal regimes, being separated virtually. So, it seems perfectly possible to me that I could live next door to somebody who's a client of a different protective agency, whatever. I think that's fine, because these different legal regimes, I say agencies, which might imply that we're talking all about commercial entities, but I can imagine you'd have for-profit, not-for-profit entities. You might have, religious legal systems, Catholic canon law, or, Jewish rabbinic law, serving different populations, Muslim law. But in any case, folks affiliated with these different legal systems and different agencies that then actually implemented these systems, I think could live side by side. And the reason is, I think, at least twofold. First of all, that just the pressures of actual common life are going to push toward a significant measure of convergence. And also, where there isn't convergence, the legal systems themselves, the legal regimes themselves, would have obvious reason to want to negotiate agreements with each other that would minimize conflict both between the regimes. They don't want to start fighting wars with each other, and also conflicts between their members, which would then invoke the participation of the regime. So I think there would be obvious market pressures toward cooperation in general, and where possible standardization across these. And so I think people could coexist nicely enough. Again, if you've got the kibbutz someplace that operates very differently from the downtown Manhattan highly commercial environment that you might envision, I don't see any necessary reason there's an obvious conflict there. As long as people can easily enough get along with each other, it's not as if to run a kibbutz you have to try to take over downtown Manhattan, and it's not as if to run downtown Manhattan you have to try to run the kibbutzniks off their land. So I think I'm not terribly worried about the possibility of cooperation.
Gotcha. So does your research and interest in anarchy affect your work in academia?
I'm sorry, does it affect?
Your work in academia?
So I guess when you say affect my work in academia, I'm not sure. There are two things you might mean. Does it affect the content of what I do? Well, sure, because a lot of what I do as an academic has been work that is in one way or another related to my my political commitments, right? So I wrote this substantial book, Anarchy and Legal Order, which is heavily footnoted, heavy, and maybe dull and dry academic work. Again, Radicalizing Rawls includes some discussion of market anarchism. The book that I did after that, Public Practice, Private Law, includes a chapter arguing for the exit of the state from the marriage business. And a book that I'm working on right now that has to do with freedom of speech, defends freedom of speech in part. I think there's a bunch of interesting overlapping defenses for it, but one of the defenses certainly has to do with the sort of robust scheme of property rights of a kind that would solve a lot of free speech problems, but which don't typically get invoked in more kind of statist accounts of the issue of free speech. So it certainly affects the substance of my work in a variety of ways. Not everything I do is related to my anarchism and legal and political philosophy, but that certainly seems to show up in a variety of settings.
So let's talk a little bit about the Center for a Stateless Society.
Sure.
What is the purpose of them, and what roles do you fill there?
So the Center for Stateless Society is a think tank and a media center. So by think tank, I mean that it generates sustained, detailed anarchist evaluations and assessments and proposals related to both current social problems and long-term concerns about a stateless society. It's also a media center in that it produces a lot of essentially op-ed content that is shared widely with newspapers and online media outlets, trying to offer a market anarchist perspective on the news. So it serves as, I think, a voice for the kind of left market anarchism that I tried to describe. So far, it's been entirely virtual. There's no bat cave anywhere with people hiding behind lots of monitors and sending out the latest market anarchist or left market anarchist party line. But it really began just as a website and attracted more and more participation during the course of the last 10 years. As a group of people who'd been active for a long time were joined by a number of younger philosophers and economists and activists of various kinds. The conversation was enriched, I think, in a whole range of ways. And the practical effect, I think, of all of that has been the generation of a tremendous amount of content. Again, everything from quite extended academic pieces to punchy op-eds. To interesting back and forth conversations about matters that are of current importance, either to various sorts of anarchists, to various sorts of market-oriented folks, and so forth. My role really has just been to be part of conversations, and I help to shape the kind of the operating structure of the center, though. It's not as if this is a group that's focused on arguing fine points of, bylaw interpretation. But I tried to participate in that. I, participated in a whole range of conversations, and just as a contributor to the fundraising of the center on occasion, and certainly to writing op-eds and helping get the message out. So my role hasn't been central. There's certainly other people more actively involved. The great Sheldon Richman has served as chair of the C4SS trustees from the beginning. The very passionate and sharp and articulate William Gillis has been the director for a while. But I've been glad to play a role in helping to make this community happen and helping to get the ideas out.
So you've been an active member of the Libertarian Party and also spoken very critically of the effectiveness of the electoral process in achieving libertarian goals. Mm-hmm. Can you explain when you feel politics is a desirable tool for achieving libertarian ideas?
Yeah, good question. So I very much stand by what I wrote about this in 2012 and updated in 2016 in a little op-ed called Just Say No, in which I tried to spell out a range of reasons for doubts about the effectiveness of the electoral process. And I think it's quite clear that not voting very frequently doesn't very frequently doesn't accomplish things. And maybe most worrisomely to me, what voting often does for people is to get them to embrace a mindless team spirit, to dive into the world of electoral contests and enthusiastically talk about what the people on my team are up to. Go team blue, go team red. And I think, frankly, that involves just throwing your critical faculties out the window. And the team approach to electoral politics makes it really easy to embrace that view. So I don't have the view that somehow any and all participation in electoral politics should be seen as evil. I wrote what I intended as a fairly careful kind of assessment in 2012 of the Ron Paul campaign. I felt like Ron did a lot of great things in terms of pushing back against the Washington consensus about military intervention and really in other ways energizing people in opposing state encroachment. And of course, when the Libertarian Party was founded, Murray Rothbard, at any rate, really saw the primary function of participation in electoral politics as educational. I certainly don't have a problem with that if you want to use it that way. And I don't have a problem with participation in electoral politics if, for one reason or another, you actually are warranted in believing that your electoral participation is going to be defensive, that you might well be able, by participating in an election, to stop something awful from happening. But I think that it's just really important to put as little faith as possible in a process that has, after all, as Lysander Spooner noted, given us what we have now.
Makes perfect sense. So you have a new book coming out, The Logic of Commitment. Am I correct?
I do, yes.
Can you give us a sneak peek into the content?
Absolutely. So this is a book that's been out, I guess, really since the end of July. It's a short book about making and keeping commitments. Now, some people use the word commitment as if it were synonymous with serious promise, and that's fine. I have no objection to that. I'm not the language police, but I've chosen to use the word commitment in a slightly different way, as a word for not so much promises we make to other people, but instead plans or decisions that we make on our own. Okay, so this might be everything, anything from this morning I decide that I'm not going to answer the phone all morning so I can get some work done, all the way to I'm going to spend the next 3 years taking the classes I need to prepare to apply for medical school, and then I'm going to go ahead and do well and become a doctor. To, I'm going to move to Duluth. All sorts of different things, ways in which I try to structure my future, to impose some order on my future with a decision or cluster of decisions that I make now. And so what I'm interested in the book, I guess, is this. Why would I want to do that? And having done it, why would I want to stick with the commitments that I've made? So in the first 3 chapters of the book, I look at 3 different kinds of reasons that people might give. First, instrumental reasons, which are discussed actually at great length by Robert Nozick in his book on rationality. In the next chapter, reasons that have to do really with just sort of maintaining coherence in one's life and among one's decisions. And then in the next chapter, a discussion of how commitments help to enable us to make decisions and organize our lives, given that there are so many different ways in which our lives could go well and go poorly as a result. But in any event, there are so many different reasonable choices that we might make. And yet, if we don't make some choices that really structure and focus our energies, nothing will really go well. So I try to talk a bit about that. And then in the remainder of the book, I look at the relationship between commitment and the idea of vocation. Sometimes, again, people can use words however they want. Sometimes the word vocation just means, somebody's work. But what I have in mind is the idea, which also people do sometimes use, of a vocation as a kind of task that I have that's distinctly mine. And that sometimes feels like it's imposed from the outside. And yet what I want to argue in that chapter is the commitments which I choose and vocations which might feel like they're imposed from the outside may not be as different as we think. And then finally, in the last chapter, I talk a little bit about the relationship between commitment understood this way and love. I'm expanding there a discussion of that topic in chapter 1 of that earlier book that I mentioned, Public Practice, Private Law. So fundamentally, this is a book about why we might make or keep commitments, not in the sense of serious promises to others, but in the sense of decisions made to or with ourselves about how to structure our futures.
Nice. Awesome. Well, that's all the questions I have for you today, sir. Do you have any events or websites you'd like to send people to?
So I certainly want to encourage people to check out c4ss.org, the website of the Center for a Stateless Society. And you can also check out my website, which you can access at garychartier.net or garychartier.com. The one will resolve to the other, though unfortunately that hasn't been updated lately. I certainly encourage people to think about a variety of cool events that are coming up. One that I'm especially excited about next April in San Diego is Libertopia, an event that hasn't happened for several years, but that started originally in the last decade with a wonderful array of speakers. I've been honored to be a speaker at every Libertopia event. It brings together radical libertarians who really want to talk about both the underlying logic of a free society and the practicalities of getting there and the practicalities of maintaining such a society. And there should be, I don't know who's a confirmed speaker yet for next year, but I can tell you that if you visit Libertopia online, I think it's libertopia.org, but in any case, just Google Libertopia and you'll find it. You'll discover some great things going on there, and it would be great to see everybody listening to this conversation show up there.
Nice. Well, thanks again for coming on, Gary. We appreciate it. Thank you guys for watching. Make sure you hit subscribe on the YouTube channel at Think Liberty TV. Go to the website at think-liberty.com and check us out on Facebook at thinkliberty.tl. Thanks again, Gary. We appreciate you coming on.
Pleasure to be here.